starting from the beginning. I'll reconvene the hearing. Wednesday, the 13th of August at 10:30. We're primarily reconvening the hearing to hear from Dr. Robertson. But just before getting underway with that, I just want to bring up two matters to bring to people's attention. The first one was yesterday we received a response from the applicant to our question in minute 8, item 3, which is regarding the risk assessment for the alternative openings, and that, so we received that, and that has been distributed to all the parties. The second matter was that we issued minute 9, which was is our response to a request for exclusion from an expert for the planning conferencing, and that's been issued to the parties. So those are the main two items that have occurred since the adjournment back on the 31st. There was just one other matter while it's fresh in my mind, and Ms. Williams, that was you're going to send me a copy of the Awarua Water Trust versus Meridian decision.
I will get onto that, absolutely. Sure. So Awarua and Meridian, yes, that's fine.
Yep. So,
and then the other matter, which was covered in the email that went alongside the risk assessment, but just to make sure that this is on the record as well, is that the applicants have had a meeting and have decided to confine the alternative opening locations to Hanson's Bay and the fence, and that is clear on the risk assessment, but just to put that on the record, and I will address that more fully in the right of reply.
Yep, thank you. Yes, just on the Awarua, that decision, would you be able to provide that to Ms. Onko by 3 p.m. tomorrow? So,
should be.
Okay, thank you. Right. So, Ms. Williams, turning over to you to introduce your witness.
Thank you. So, Dr. Robertson, your full name is Hugh Alistair Robertson, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you are currently employed as a Principal Science Advisor for the Department of Conservation to Papa'atawhai.
Yes.
And you have prepared a evidence in this matter dated the 11th of July 2025?
That's correct.
And at paragraph 4 to 16 of that evidence, it sets out your qualifications and experience.
That's correct.
And if we move then to paragraph 20, in that paragraph, you acknowledge that you have provided this evidence as an expert witness, that you have an overriding duty to impartially assist the commissioners on matters within your area of expertise. The views that you express are your views, and you do not speak on behalf of the applicants and in particular the department.
Correct.
Dr. Robertson, do you have some opening remarks that you would like to make?
Yes, and I'll just have a drink of water. It's just something stuck in my throat. Apologies. So I do have some brief remarks, if that's okay, Chair, just to introduce the evidence for the session this morning. I'll also just outline the scope of my evidence as well. And after that, I'll just pause and ask you a question about how best to proceed as I go through my introduction. So I'll just get underway now, if that's okay. So as Ms. Williams has introduced, I work for the Department of Conservation, and I've been associated with scientific advice and field assessments for Waituna Lagoon and the wider Awarua wetland complex for over 15 years. The last time I took, I guess, detailed assessment or survey was in September 2024, when there was a high water level period at that time, and I was examining out on a boat on the lagoon the distribution of some of the submerged plants at that time, to seeing what the effect of the high water was in terms of, do we see photosynthesizing plants and so forth. I've also led the multidisciplinary science advisory group report that supported this application as outlined in my evidence, working with a range of different experts from different disciplines. The scope of my evidence was outlined in paragraph 22 of my evidence, and there were 5 key elements. One, I just provided some comments on the ecological importance of Waitangi Lagoon. Then secondly, the multi-value approach to inform the management of the water levels and opening regime. Thirdly, I examined or just described the different hydrological scenarios and how these have guided the assessment of proposed opening regimes. The fourth aspect was just examining previous information and surveys of the fringing wetland vegetation environment and the effects of different water level regimes on those communities, plant communities. And finally, the fifth thing I did was provide some comments on just the appropriateness of the conditions overall. So for each of these 5 areas, I've just got some very brief remarks on each, and responding also just to some of the questions I've seen from the hearing that was held recently. I guess the question just to yourself, Chair, I could just go through all 5 aspects and sort of pause for questions at the end, or was it best I sort of pause at each section, or you just ask questions as you go? I don't know what is most suitable.
Let's try and do it where we ask questions maybe at the end of each section. It's not quite where the sort of thing where we're able to interrupt you just in the forum we're in. So let's try for questions at the end of each section. Thank you.
Thank you. So initially, I'll just touch on the ecological importance or significance of the lagoon. And I'll just do some brief comments each time. I won't go through my evidence in detail because that will take too long, of course. So the lagoon and associated Awarua wetland complex is one of the largest remaining wetland complexes in New Zealand. And the Awarua wetland was designated, as you're well aware, a Ramsar site, a wetland of international importance under the Convention of Wetlands. Initially in 1976, but it was then expanded, and it now covers an area of approximately 20,000 hectares. And the most recent assessment of the Ramsar site indicate it meets 8 of the 9 criteria of international importance as a Ramsar site. And the lagoon itself supports many of those internationally recognised values. The efforts to restore the ecological health of Waitangi Lagoon, as is proposed in the consent application, are, in my opinion, consistent with the commitment under the Convention to promote the conservation of designated Ramsar sites. And I'll come back to that point soon. Another aspect of ecological significance that I wanted to just mention was that the lagoon ecosystem type is recognised as a naturally uncommon ecosystem in New Zealand. That was work that was led by Manaaki Whenua-Lankea research people a while ago. And following on from that definition as a naturally uncommon ecosystem type, some IUCN criteria were then applied, and it's been identified as an endangered ecosystem type in New Zealand as well. That's a lagoon systems. And in my view, understanding the natural features and processes of these Waituna type lagoons is of high relevance to determining how best to conserve its natural character. And that's connected with, conserving the natural character of New Zealand's indigenous ecosystems overall. And so without an understanding of these natural processes, there may be a risk that a restricted set of biodiversity or other values may be used to guide the water levels of Waitangi Lagoon. And I'll come back to that a few times about taking a multi-value approach. I note comments from some submitters in relation to Ramsar sites, noting that the site was initially designated in 1976. In terms of, it does have a lot of bird values, for example, that were identified at the time. But a key thing about, I guess, Ramsar sites is the maintenance or enhancement of their ecological character. And so we're not, in a sense, locked in time and not able to restore a Ramsar site to improve its overall ecological character. That's very much aligned with the goals of the convention to promote the maintenance and enhancement of Ramsar sites. And a recent example, for example, is our most recently designated Ramsar site in New Zealand is actually Lake Wairarapa in the Wairarapa system. Now, it has a range of different values, but it also has very degraded water quality. And so the goal there would not be to maintain the Wairarapa system as it is, but to actually to promote its overall enhancement. And another key concept actually is wise use under the convention. And wise use actually is related to maintaining and enhancing the ecological character of wetlands. And that's designated or specified under Article 3.1 of the Convention. And ecological character is the combination of its values, processes, and services. And wise use specifically recommends an ecosystem-based approach, so looking at the overall range of processes and values. So I hope that's useful in regards to some of those comments that have been received. That's all I have on the ecological significance for my introduction, so I can pause here if you like before I go on to the next topic.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any questions at this point?
No, not from me.
Mr. Chair, I do have one or two.
Yep.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Robertson. I understand you've been at the Ramsar Convention over the last week or two.
That's right.
Thank you. Yeah, just very briefly, I think most people involved in this have understood the importance of the lagoon and respect that. I'm interested to know, you talk about it meeting 8 of the 9 criteria. Has that always been the case from its initial designation in, was it 1976, or has that changed over time?
It has changed over time, particularly when the site was expanded. So it was a much smaller area initially, but it was expanded in its extent in 2008 to include a much broader area of including Awarua Bay and going out to New River Estuary and things like that as well. So the initial set of criteria was not as broad, I guess, because it was a smaller environment at that time. Also, we've had more surveys and other things undertaken over time. So as time has moved on, we have more information. We've got a better understanding of the full range of values that the site has, which wasn't going to necessarily be the case in 1976.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, understand the expansion, but the lagoon itself, has that sort of increased in its meeting of the number of criteria over time?
I haven't actually done a side-by-side analysis going back to the initial designation, but I could do that following this hearing if that's useful.
Well, it might have been helpful just to understand how the regimes have influenced those criteria over that time. So yes, that might be something worth considering in reply, perhaps.
What I could comment, I guess, is that the lagoon's, I guess, opening regime was in place, in terms of the opening of the lagoon to reduce water levels. Back in time, it was often for farm drainage as a primary reason back in the 1970s. So the estuarine phases have been occurring for well before the Ramsar site was in place. And so around that time of designation, it would still definitely have had estuarine phases as well as closed freshwater phases, and then the response of the biodiversity in correspondence to that.
Thank you. And in your explanation of wise use, that was very helpful. Thank you. I noticed it did include services, and of course, I guess land drainage would be seen in that, perhaps in that perspective, or was it just ecosystem services?
It's typically looking at the ecosystem services of the wetland itself. So what is the cultural, the provisioning, the regulating services that wetlands, as they're managed in terms of you maintaining their ecological character, what are the services that have been provided? So I would personally not classify land drainage as a service of the wetland. That's just a human act, I guess.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful clarification. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair, at this stage.
Thank you. Back to you, Dr. Robinson.
Thanks. Just a few brief remarks on the multi-value approach that was undertaken and is outlined in my evidence and other materials. So the proposed management and restoration of the ecological health of the lagoon in terms of opening events considers the environmental water requirements of multiple ecological values. It considered, as you are now well aware, the responses or expected response of fish communities, submerged plants, water quality, avifauna, and also fringing vegetation to different lagoon water level scenarios. These different values will have different responses to water level variation, and they can also be opportunistic responses where particular biota do better in a particular environment, although this may not reflect the natural processes of the ecosystem. And the systematic approach we have undertaken is described in paragraph 47 of my evidence. So just a few introductory remarks there to emphasize that we, as a collective science group, which I oversaw, have really done our best to optimize the water level regime, taking on board all the different values that we considered. Thank you. If there's nothing there, I'll just move on to the description of hydrology.
Well, just before,
Commissioner Boothroyd might have a question.
I do actually, yes. Of course, we've had the benefit. Actually, Dr. Robbins, it's worth knowing, have you had the opportunity to perhaps review the hearing online or the recordings online?
Not the recording specifically, however, I have had at least 2 meetings with my colleagues to ask them about specific areas that would be of relevance to myself, and they sent through a range of notes and different questions that I might wish to consider.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, we have had statements and heard from a number of submitters, and some of them have highlighted, and I think I'll raise it here, since we're talking about the multi-values, the overemphasis on some particular values, if you like, of the lagoon, particularly the rupia, as opposed to either a broader church of values or even some alternative values, perhaps around some of the salt marsh or even particular other plant species that occur in those other environments. So I guess what I'm asking is in your view, accepting, I understand there's multi-values, but over-relying on perhaps on just 1 or 2 species, is that an over-reliance?
My personal view is no. We have been at pains, I guess, just speaking on my view on how we worked as a collective science group. And one of my roles as summarised in the evidence was to consider the range of different values and the range of different pressures and threats that the lagoon is under. And it's an existing environment where there is a modified catchment, which is typical for New Zealand. So we have elevated levels, for example, of nutrients coming into the system, which we're all well aware can put pressure in terms of water quality and algal bloom risk, for example. In addition to the other main driver of the system, in addition to the water quality driver, which is one of the main drivers in my view, is the hydrological regime, I guess, which is what this consent is focused on. And so very high frequent opening, what is the impact of that on the different values, or conversely, just allowing the thing to be completely naturally an unmanaged system, which may mean very prolonged freshwater phases. And there's significant risks across a range of values on both of those scenarios. And so it is an attempt to optimize the management of the natural process of the lagoon, but considering the bird communities across the broader wetland complex, considering, again, the natural environment of which the lagoon is placed in, the fish responses, as well as been articulated by other experts. Certainly submerged plants. Rupia is the dominant submerged plant, but there are others. Lamprothronium, for example, a charophyte species, and Myriophyllum, another aquatic plant, also occur in good numbers at times. the fringing vegetation and so forth. And so it really, but I guess we have identified that many lake type systems or lagoon type systems around the world and New Zealand often have what we would call an ecosystem engineer or a keystone species that is really critical in actually driving the overall health of the system in terms of how it responds to water quality events, changing light climates, providing habitat for invertebrates, though we haven't examined invertebrates unfortunately in detail, and for fish. And so it is seen in many, systems of, lacustrine lake type systems in New Zealand, the critical role that these submerged plants have in the overall ecosystem health. So maybe it can be seen as an emphasis on that, but the reason why, by maintaining that value, is you're supporting so many other values in the lagoon, including its water quality and bird life and so forth. So we then, I guess, by looking at the different ways that opening and closing regimes could be considered, it's like, well, how can we maximize its overall health, but not having a overly negative effect, for example, on fish, as an example, and therefore we're recognizing the need to have a fish migration consent to enable that when we haven't, though you could argue naturally it might have been closed for 5 or 10 years, and fish migration 100 years ago might have been quite sporadic. And the same for the bird communities. You might have had prolonged estuarine phases and prolonged freshwater phases, and the birds and other things would respond to that. And that's the way that nature, naturally works. So we're also taking that into account, managing the processes of this lagoon, but we're not unfortunately in a situation where we can leave it unmanaged because the water quality threat is significant. So and the emergency events that occurred recently, they were disappointing to myself too. My view is if the consent had been in place at that time, we would not have got to a situation where those emergencies events would have occurred because the water quality triggers would have been in place. And we're well past a 2-year phase, I think, at that stage for opening the lagoon for fish as well. A long answer. I apologise, but I guess hopefully that helps you.
Well, it is helpful, thanks. We might come back to a couple of the matters you've raised there, but I think it's worth continuing on with your statement now, Mr. Chair.
I just have one question though, just about this section. Yep. So my question is that the lagoon has predominantly been opened by human intervention for decades. And so how does that affect your ability to interpret the current ecological data? And so put another way, what is the usefulness of the existing baselines for predicting the effects at the different trigger levels?
What we'll have seen, particularly thank you for the question, from the reports that Mary de Winter have spoken to, these that have been undertaken for over a decade now, close to, I think it's more than 10 years, is that with that relatively long-term data set, to get this keystone part, this ecosystem engineer back in place, it has been clear that having a period of around 2 years is extremely beneficial for macrophyte re-establishment and to see it go through its full life cycle and including sexual reproduction of the plants and things as well. So we have seen that plant community is extremely vulnerable to opening and closing events. And the evidence we have from that 10-year period is that very positive responses when we were able to have that prolonged freshwater phase. So that is one of the key things that has, I guess, identified that, the lagoon was showing signs of, macroalgal proliferation back in around 2011, 2010, where there was very big concerns at that time around the macroalgae developing in the lagoon that triggered an initial response by the council and by the department and others. And that wasn't because we were prolonging water level durations at that time. That was just in response to a very low biomass of aquatic plants that's themed and higher abundance of macroalgae in the system. So I think, in my view, we do have good indication that what is proposed is backed up by the observations of NIWA scientists and others.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll move on to the next phase, if that's okay, Chair.
Dr. Robertson, could you just, I can see the other commissioners writing, so we'll just wait for them to, yep. Okay, no, carry on, thank you.
I'll just touch on the different hydrological scenarios that we examined in the multi-value assessment, including looking back to the period of the last consent that was in place from around 2017 to 2022. Now, at that time, water levels were actually modified slightly to try and promote or to try and reduce spring-summer opening as part of that previous consent. However, with those levels that were in place at that time, water levels still often triggered the level for lagoon opening, and this is outlined in my evidence, which led to an opening event. And the consequence often was that those led to a prolonged open period with tidal influence, when the goal at those times was to try and reduce those spring and summer openings if possible. The frequency of opening events at that time had a negative effect on some values and did not reflect natural processes. However, as I've commented, given the changes in land use in the catchment and the relatively high concentration of nutrients, prolonged opening or closed conditions also risks water quality decline and algal proliferation. And so by examining the different hydrological scenarios, it was really to identify a balanced approach to lagoon management to promote restoration. By minimizing frequency where possible of human-induced opening events to promote recovery of lagoon processes and establishment of those keystone species and to support fringing vegetation, but also being responsive to water quality, ecosystem health, such as dissolved oxygen and or low dissolved oxygen issues that may occur, and fish migration. In Table 4 of my evidence summarizes the effect of different water level thresholds on the frequency of opening events, which is based on hydrological models developed by the Environment Southland science team. Under the previous consent, that table indicates that these openings were occurring about once every year, or are predicted to occur about once every year, but the proposed traditional regime, this will reduce. And there have been some questions I recognise from different submitters about the necessity of 2.5, like why 2.5 versus why not 2.3? And I'll just try and explain that. A primary goal is to reduce the frequency of these opening events while still being responsive to things like water quality. And it's about having more headroom available in a sense, so climate systems can pass through. And so the lagoon is large, over 1,300 hectares. So there's a large volume of water can sit in that lagoon. And it does seep through the gravel barrier, as I understand it. It's been described by some of the other experts. And so there's a natural dropping of water that occurs once a storm event passes through. And by having, in a sense, going by up to 2.5 meters, it's just a sense, the probability of you actually meeting the trigger level in a particular year. There's lower probability at 2.5 than there is at 2.4 than there is at 2.3. And so that's one of the key reasons why we are suggesting that transition to 2.5 meters to decrease the probability of an event being required that is not really desired at the particular year, because of everything else being, good, that is. And the 2.5, however, is also driven by two other factors. Those are the potential stress of higher water levels on light penetrating to enable photosynthesis of aquatic plants. And Mary de Winton, I think, commented on that in her evidence as well. These plants can withstand perhaps a month. I think she suggested up to 4 months of lower light levels. So there is a period of time where there is the ability of these plants to sustain lower light. But you also get, if you start pushing above 2.5 meters, you're going to increase the stress on those plants as well. Hence why it's proposed at this time to have that maximum trigger level of around 2.5 to balance the need to actually have the water for the environment, for natural processes, but at the same time the stress from low light that may occur from prolonged periods at high levels. The other aspect is also the inundation of fringing wetland vegetation. And this is also commented in some of the supplementary information that has been provided. So much of that fringing wetland area is probably I think about 2.3 meters, will be inundated at around 2.3 meters. And so by putting a whole lot of extra water, above 2.5, another 20, 30 centimeters perhaps on those fringing wetland vegetation is quite a big shift in a sense. And so it's a sort of this transitional approach which is now suggested by the applicants of going from 2.4 initially for the first couple of periods and then eventually up to 2.5 is also, I think, appropriate to enable the fringing wetland vegetation to restore itself appropriately too. And I think that's all I have with regards to the hydrological cycle. So if that's, I'll pause there.
Thank you. I've got a question, which when you say it's at the probability issues regarding the 2.5, the 2.5 isn't actually a maximum. It's just that once you get there, you may release it. So there's no compulsion to do that. Why would you not open it at 2.5?
I guess it's a planning words, good point. I guess the word may as opposed to will.
I prefer must.
Must. And I'll let my colleagues speak to that planning terminology. It's not my area. But in terms of the scientific advice around 2.5 meters is when the water is at that level. And I think it's suggested for 7 days, because you can also get events that pass through. You might be above that level for 2 hours or for 30 minutes or something. So we're looking for a sustained, I guess, high water level period. And what we have seen is the duration, I guess, of that period of things like light limitation. So as you get up to 2.5 meters, there's also an increased probability of higher water levels for a period of time. And I guess it's just based on the balance of advice that we've received from the various experts is that it seems appropriate to open when we get to that level to reduce things like light limitation pressure on the plants. However, I mean, ecosystems are not perfect, of course. If we had very good science and we could have light modeling and light monitoring occurring around the clock, you might find that the light climate during that period is actually very good. But that's a big expense to put on the applicants to require that sort of level of light monitoring, which is going to be respondent to the algal dominance in the lagoon or sediment levels and other things like this. So it's really just based on our best advice on the pressure on the things like submerged plants that can occur for having a higher water levels for a period of time.
So can you want to condense it probably more to what? I'm trying to understand what circumstances would you not release it at 2.5 when after the 7 days or whatever those are. I'm trying to understand in what circumstances would you not open it.
I think the conditions as they're proposed, the science advisory group would provide advice to the applicants. So you're correct in a sense, we would look across a range of values in terms of the fish community, bird community, and so forth to see if there's any significant pressure on the environment. But I guess a large aspect of this had also been the pressure on, and we'd been, I guess, as applicants listening to the farming community about the impacts at that level. So even the reason why I think the applicants have proposed going to 2.4 in amended conditions initially is hearing the concerns from some of the submitters. So from a purely scientific perspective, there may be actually, if the lagoon is perfectly good health, going above 2.5 meters could actually be beneficial, to be perfectly honest.
Yep.
But there is an awareness of the pressure on some of the farming community and where some of the purchase had been occurring. And that was why the advice had been also around a need for an opening to occur. But in truth, you may find that the concerns around the light climate or fringing wetland vegetation in 10 years' time and so forth is of lower concern. And that is my advice, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Boothroyd, Commissioner Mackay, do you have any questions at this point?
I do, just following on Dr. Robertson from that commentary. So you said that if it gets to 2 at 5, you'd be seeking some advice on the, I guess, the impacts of that on the ecology of the lagoon. That suggests to me that you would go out and do some work to assess that, because some of the data collection may be dated or well before it got to the 2.5. Is that my understanding? Is that correct?
Well, in terms of things like light limitation, we would have hydrological information being continuously monitored in terms of the levels. So we would know that the duration that the lagoon had been, let's say, above 2.2 or 2.3, just purely based on the logging that is occurring in terms of water levels. So in terms of the light aspect, we could then assume, based on the knowledge we have already, which is not too bad in terms of the light pressure, that we could make a prediction of exactly how light stress the lagoon has been, how many weeks, months, and so forth the lagoon has been putting at a certain level and having stress on that plant community. So that wouldn't necessarily require any additional monitoring. And the annual plant surveys which have been undertaken by NIWA have also been very informative to us to generally understand the abundance of the plants at different times.
I guess I'm just struggling to understand that at that point, as you mentioned, there'd be some kind of decision made. But I agree that you have some data, but you're not necessarily suggesting going out and collecting any new data after that time. That's what I'm just trying to ascertain, and relying on that.
I'll be relying, I think the Science Advisory Group would rely on our understanding of the different ecological values that are present in the lagoon, and then looking at the duration of the high water period that has occurred preceding that 2.5 level.
So, I've got a related question in that how long how long after the trigger level for the water level being reached 2.5 at 7 days, how long is it going to take for the science group to provide advice to the council or to the consent holder as to when an opening should or shouldn't occur?
We have some experience of that from the emergency opening event. So we convened in a more informal way than is suggested through this consent process, a range of experts to provide fairly quick advice to the regional council at that time around the condition of the lagoon and the need for emergency opening. And we were often waiting for water quality samples to be data just to be coming through, and that was because it was an algal issue. So council was taking regular water samples. They were sending off to the lab, and in a sense, as soon as the lab results came back to us, we had an online meeting, reached an agreement, and then wrote that up typically the next day to pass it through to the council. So given things such as online meetings, we can convene ourselves fairly quickly as information comes forward.
I probably asked this question during the actual hearing, but can't remember the answer. How long does it take to do get a water quality sample done, if you know?
Certainly, yeah, I've been involved in various sampling programs. Laboratories such as Hills is one of the main laboratories utilised for water quality tests, and I think the council uses that. And you can, it depends on Hills's backlog. You can tell them, you get them couried in a sense the day that you collect the sample, so that it's very quick to collect the sample on a boat. They get couried to the lab, and it may take 2 or 3 days to get the results back.
Thank you. Apologies, Commissioner Boothroyd, I interrupted.
That's okay. Perhaps I will just continue in that vein. And I know Ms. McKay looks like got some questions, but one of the things that came up actually during the hearing in Invercargill. A word was used about adaptive management, and I sought some clarification around that because that has various meanings to different people. And my understanding was that in a more sort of science formal understanding of adaptive management, we're not really talking about adaptive management. We're talking about responding by opening the lagoon to certain triggered criteria. So there's only really one action. I just wanted to be clear that's your understanding of that term, if it were used, which is probably best avoided.
Yes, I wouldn't term this as adaptive management either. The recommendation to the applicants is to have monitoring in place that enables determination of whether those triggers have been reached or not, and then just consideration of the monitoring advice and then recommendation based on that to inform the decision or not that the conditions get activated.
Thank you. That's helpful clarification. And the other question I did ask as well was kind of understanding, is there a risk, I guess, that we start seeing with this regime any form of kind of boom and bust pattern of, well, algal blooms being one of them, of course, perhaps the more riskier one, but even in the Rūpia and other features by this regime, and would it be any different to what has occurred in the past?
Dr. Schellenberg may have also talked about this topic because it is something that he has studied previously, is in modified environments, in lacustrine, lagoon type environments around the world. Sometimes you can observe big shifts in communities occurring, for example, in response to eutrophication, so excessive nutrient loads. And so this is one of, I guess, of the water quality risks we're very mindful of, because we do not want to get a situation of we get boom and bust of phytoplankton or cyanobacteria on a frequent basis. We actually want to reduce and manage that, and hence you got the early warning and sort of critical trigger levels for that. In terms of the promoting the growth of the submerged plants, is there a boom or bust potential for that? There has been advice previously that the ecological guidelines for lagoon has suggested is we're sort of aiming for a 30% cover of these aquatic plants. And often when the lagoon is in open phase, it's well below that. And, and this, I guess, is one of the concerns. By having, in a sense, an opening period of only every 2 years, I think it's unlikely to get a very large biomass of those aquatic plants, because we're not going to have many years of it accumulating that plant biomass, and in a sense go through a 2-year growth period and then dieback will occur again. Not that dissimilar to what has been happening in the past on a 1-year cycle, just going to a 2-year cycle. So my view is that for very long closed periods, you could get extreme growth perhaps, but that is not proposed in the regime that has been suggested.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Mackay, did you have any questions of this?
Kia ora, almost all of mine are answered. I just have one more which focuses on the discussion around decision-making processes and timeframes. Mm-hmm. So I think we've canvassed quite clearly what the Science Advisory Group role will be. In the Appendix B to the application, that's the Science Advisory Group report. And in that, it shows quite a bit of detail around how these entities and groups have operated previously. And so I wanted to get some type of understanding from you, since you seem to have quite a bit of the background, how these 3 consent holders will operate together to make a decision, because there was quite a bit of criticism or concern raised from the submitters that it would be, even once the Science Advisory Group has provided their advice, that there would be a lag or a delay. And I wanted to know how relevant is that concern?
From my experience, I guess I'll go back to these the emergency opening events, and to a certain degree advice that the science group has provided on openings previously too. I shall touch firstly, I guess, just on the organisation of the Science Advisory Group proposed. So I support what is suggested by the applicants in terms of a clear chair of that Science Advisory Group, for example, having a community representative with knowledge of the system as well as appropriate experts with different knowledge, as suggested. And in that aspect, even though it's been a bit more informal than what is proposed, has, from my view, functioned well. We have, in a sense, followed code of conduct type process where we're not representing our organisations. We're there just as technical science people saying, what is the best for this lagoon, even though we may be employed or have been employed by different agencies, including. So that has, for me, worked well. In terms of the governance aspects around that emergency lagoon, that was an activity of the emergency openings under a different section of the RMA, I guess, in this consent, where the council was, determining its requirement, and it was very clear that our advice was going, through to the council. But what I'm going to pause on is, even at that time, what I observed was the communication between Te Ao Marama, Awarua Rūnanga, as well as the Department of Conservation, in terms of the decision makers in each of those bodies was present. They were talking to each other about this is what is occurring. And so I guess, and even with the joint application itself and coming together, so from my view, I guess just from a technical side of things, I haven't had personally any concerns. But that doesn't mean that, I guess, you still have to look at those in a planning sense to make sure they're going to be effective.
Okay, thank you. And we have actually asked Ms. Williams for some information around how it all knits together. So with whakatumana to Waituna Trust and to Waipārita Trust, and whether or not they have any formal role in this, and if so, how. So hopefully we'll get that clarity in the right reply.
I think you're on mute, Chair. I can't hear you.
Sorry, we're just going to take a brief adjournment. I have to deal with something to keep the noise down out here. We'll reconvene at 11:24 to be precise. So we'll just take a brief adjournment now. Thank you. Very good. We'll reconvene. Problems of living in an urban area. Dr. Robertson, I think we're on to your next topic. Thank you.
Yeah, there's just 2 to go, and they won't take very long. Just a few remarks on the fringing vegetation, the different plant communities. These were for the lagoon. They were most recently surveyed, as I outlined in my evidence, in 2012 and 2013. So over a decade ago now. And at that time, 15 transects that extended from the lagoon edge down towards the shoreline. From the shoreline, towards the higher ground, were surveyed. I did not undertake these plant surveys myself. I should make that clear, but I do have a background in plant ecology, and I have taken surveys within the lagoon and other parts of the Awarua complex. They were undertaken by Jesse Blythell, and in a report that was published or written up, I should say, in 2013. And it observed that the main plant community, most dominant, is an oi restiated rushland. It's Epidesmia similis. Though there are, of course, a range of other species that occur. There's also 4 at-risk plant species that have been identified from surveys in the past. And in addition to the surveys that Jesse Blythell took, also local dock botanists, for example, Brian Rance, he's now retired, also took surveys for things such as the Discampsia cespitosa, which is a tuft of grass and other things. So these 4 at-risk plant species were in relatively small numbers in the survey. Though a couple of the species are certainly lagoon edge plants. So they're marginal plants. They occur in marshes, typically in ephemeral areas that are temporarily inundated. And the proposed transitional regime will allow the native wetland vegetation to transition gradually over time. So the vegetation, in a sense, has developed, I guess, through plant succession over time to the opening and closing regime that has been in place. And Peter Johnson, a previous botanist as well, from earlier surveys, as well as Jesse Blythell, had noticed, in a sense, a downslope moving of some plant species, including things like Manuka, given the opening regime that has been in place for a period of time. So the proposed regime will mean there will be periods of time, a month at a time, perhaps 2 months, when the water level will be at a higher water level than has been, I guess, in the recent history. But New Zealand wetland plants are adapted to fluctuating water regimes. So we need to be mindful of that, though some plant species will do better than others. But many of the exotic species, including things like exotic grasses like Yorkshire fog, holcus, lanatus, will not do as well. And so there's benefits in terms of management of many of the grass type exotic species that can dominate those areas. They will not be as resilient to some of the things such as native sedges and rushes to the fluctuating water regimes. I also note the concern of some submitters around the dieback of vegetation that may have occurred or seems to have occurred with the high water levels recently, noting that prolonged period was not unlikely to have occurred, perhaps, if the consent was in place at that time. Manuka certainly can be a native species that moves into environments fairly well, and that was one of the things which our Manuka species have observations of dieback. But I guess just a comment I have from a completely different wetland in the Waikato, where we're restoring water levels in the Whonga Merino wetland in the Waikato, so aiming to, and a weir was put in place there to restore water levels, and including to try and protect some of the native rushes and sedges. And in there, dieback of Manuka has occurred. But it's not seen as a concern in that wetland system because that Manuka had moved out into areas it had not naturally been. So in that completely different wetland environment, the dieback of native vegetation is actually just seen as part of the ecological recovery of the area. So I guess that's just an observational thing that I would pass on, is that it doesn't overly concern me if there's some dieback of species that have moved into an area. This is part of a restoration of the overall values of the Waituna Lagoon system. But I do certainly support a transitional approach as is identified in years 1 to 5 and 6 to 10 and so forth, with the winter opening still at 2.3 and 2.4 and so forth in summer, because I think that will enable a good transition of the vegetation as well as supporting the other lagoon values. So that's all I have on the fringing wetland vegetation, but I'll pause. I can pause there.
Thank you. I've got a question just in terms of the 5-yearly reviews. Again, how long is the review going to take? You reach the end of the 5-year period, it's an thing to conduct an internal review. How long does that review take?
They can be very quick or very long, as we know. So I guess it's not specified at present. Perhaps it may be useful to specify how long that review should take. I've been involved in things where very urgent advice is needed, and we can do it fairly quickly if you're actually collecting information as you go. Because I guess if you're talking about the overall assessment of the effectiveness of the consent, not just the fringing vegetation, you're talking about everything? Or...
Yeah, as it's set out in the conditions, that review, yeah.
Because
the 5-yearly review, not the 128 that the council, section 128 of the RMA that the council's able to do, but the internal review for 5, 10, 15, etc.
Because many of the monitoring, much of the monitoring proposed is coming in more frequently. For example, the water quality monitoring is frequent, the water level assessment is frequent. The fish surveys, I think, is annually initially is proposed. So much of the information will already be coming in and able to be evaluated. There may be only a final, let's say the fringing vegetation, I think is proposed a longer time period for that. So you may be waiting for that, in a sense, to finalise the report. But the other aspects should be able to be analysed in advance of that, mostly.
Yeah. And if though those, would it be advantageous to have it so that the reports or whatever that to be able to undertake that review, that all that monitoring for the 5-year period beforehand was aligned so that it had all been completed and that you're not waiting for a something further to occur in the future?
Align as much as possible, yes, I would agree with that. And for example, typically the NIWA surveys that they have been undertaking on submerged plants have typically been around February as a time. That's also not a bad time for doing wetland plant surveys because you have lots of the reproductive parts of the plant in place. And so there may be, yes, a way that you can optimize some of the things that are on a longer duration, like those annual things around plants could be streamlined in terms of timing. We just have to talk to the fish experts around what the best time is for their survey as well.
And having undertaken, correct me if I'm wrong here, that the SAG undertakes the review. So if the review's undertaken, what happens with the result of that review?
That's less of a technical question, I guess. So that is one for more the planning, I guess, response, is that we would be, as a science group, providing recommendations on the effectiveness of the conditions in terms of meeting, the goal of improving the overall ecological health of the lagoon system. And with that advice, passing it to the applicant for their consideration.
Thank you.
If I can just follow through on that, Dr. Robertson, because that's an interesting component, this review, because the triggers, for example, are set in consent condition. And a recommendation might be to alter them, in fact, which would then proceed to a variation of the consent. which, as you're quite right, would be a planning process. I do understand that. But that would be subject to all sorts of, provisions, so may not be a rapid process in itself. And is that how you understand that might be an outcome of the review?
I'm such not a planner. I mean, as a scientist, we would want our, if we feel like based on the information through 5 years of if you've got data collection, that actually modifying a trigger is beneficial for the overall management of the lagoon. You do want that considered. But at the same time, there's also, we've tried to, I guess, have that flexibility a little bit with the way that the appendixes in terms of the primary values and the secondary values have been proposed. I feel, as a science, have been a previous member of that science group, with the early warning triggers as well as the other triggers, there's actually there's a range of opportunity for us to be concerned, to say, listen, we actually think some management is needed here. And so, yes, some amendment of the triggers may be required in 5 years' time, and we would recommend that. But in saying that, I don't think much is stopping us now, because we've got a good series of attributes to say to the applicants, based on what we can see, this is what we propose for the next opening event. And we're with the ecosystem and health, for example, and water quality, ability, and a fairly broad range of opportunities there to open as necessary if the information is indicating there's something of concern. So yes, the planning process is important, but I don't think it's necessarily stopping us to make good management recommendations at present.
Okay, and through that review process, as you were talking about, I wonder, Mr. Chow, I want to raise the question of sedimentation. Actually, I might do that now, if I may. We heard a fair bit from submitters. Actually, I don't know if you've been able a chance to canvass that with your colleagues on the risk of sedimentation in the lagoon, and particularly as a consequence of the higher levels of water in the lagoon backing up onto agricultural land, and the nature of the soils and the way that waterlogs and falls away, I guess, into the watercourses and into the lagoon. And we had a number of discussions about that. And we did hear from, I think it's Mr. Rabens, was it, with the water quality, and he looked at suspended sediment material. But I think it's been highlighted in your table too, actually, that sedimentation is one of the issues that these types of lagoons face. That there doesn't seem to be any monitoring of sedimentation, not suspended sediments, but of the actual sediment changing in the lagoon. And I wonder whether you had a view that that might be a worthy parameter to look at. We saw some photos that were presented by submitters and some descriptions of the kind of odor and anoxic content of some of that sediment. And they were quite concerned about the potential for that to occur. Anyway, just some thoughts from you on whether that's a worthy parameter to monitor and perhaps even respond to with regard to the triggers.
Okay. Just briefly, over a decade ago, I do remember a colleague from the regional council, they did attempt to put out, it was just an explorative pilot type study to look at sediment plates, for example, around towards different parts of the lagoon. Though we'd have to inquire about whether that was a successful assessment of sedimentation patterns. I think I should caveat with limits of my expertise. I have taken on board, I guess, a range of different advice for people with different experiences, and I don't have extreme qualifications in sedimentation myself, which I have to be clear of.
Understood.
But I have awareness of it from other systems. What I would note is that it is a shallow environment at times, not always, and there can be wind, as we know, it's the Southern Ocean not too far away, and therefore there is quite a bit of bed movement of sediment, and therefore implementing a sediment regime, if you're looking at sediment monitoring on looking at the actual build-up of sediment in the lagoon, may be complicated, perhaps, because it's a very dynamic environment, so would need advice from those working in highly dynamic environments, how to do that effectively. It would be certainly useful to know whether slightly prolonged or less frequent opening events is leading to accumulation of sediment, or whether the actual opening events in time, you don't notice any difference whatsoever. So that is a variable. You could ask that question. I don't think I can answer it right now about whether or not I would predict change in sedimentation patterns in the lagoon based on the regime we propose, because there will still be the so-called flushing events occurring, and therefore in times when areas are not, the sediment itself is exposed to the elements, that's not covered by water as well, which can lead to some, I guess, breakdown of organic materials too. Yeah, so that's probably all I have to say. There is, with just what I understand about, I guess, hydrodynamics, which is in the lagoon limited to a certain degree, there is some risk of sedimentation, but I don't know how extreme that would be. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of my understanding. We can't quite capture the uncertainty of that risk. And I guess my question is there merit in forming some monitoring of that sedimentation? It seems that we're probably not going to resolve that right now, and I understand that, but it might be worth something to think about that might be considered in reply as well.
Yeah, I think it will come. It's a cost and practicability question, and scientifically merit certainly, but then there's a risk that the science also will be uninformative. So I guess that then the cost comes into it in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, if I could add, if something, would it be practical or whatever to actually conduct the monitoring for the sediment in the Waituna Creek or the other water bodies that are feeding into the lagoon, and does that provide any information or whatever have you? Yeah.
Yeah, and on that, I guess Mr. Rabel from Environment South may have talked about the existing monitoring of suspended sediments, as you highlighted, in terms of in the lagoon, and they also have monitoring higher up in Waituna Creek. But is there a more suitable backwater environment, I guess, that is less susceptible to the dynamic environment of the lagoon itself? It's a good question, Chair.
Commissioner Mackay?
Yes, I'll just follow on with erosion, but I want to then circle back to the review process. But with the erosion and settlement issue, we asked a question of the lawyer to say, well, what are the effects that we can actually be assessing here, going from a natural environment to an opening environment? And it was made clear that we actually can assess erosion and sediment, because that is an effect of the lagoon being opened. So with that in mind, it seems that we don't have much information to be able to assess this effect. And so from my perspective, I was going to ask you some questions around, well, do we just, as a start point, that if you open less frequently and you have a higher lagoon, then will that cause greater stream bank erosion than if we were to open more frequently at a lower level? So if that's the start point, would you agree with that proposal? There'll be more at a higher lake level, more erosion occurring.
I'm just trying to understand the question. Would you like
me to rephrase it?
Yeah, if you could. I mean, I think I got it, but just
sure.
If you could rephrase it, that'd be good.
Okay. If the lagoon was opened at a higher level and less frequently, so let's say at 5 meters, then the drain would be so quicker, that there might be more erosion and more sediment, as opposed to opening every year at, say, 2 metres. So would you anticipate there would be more stream bank erosion when the lake level is higher and has a more dramatic drop?
Cool, thank you for that rephrasing. I appreciate it. Before I directly answer that, I guess I'll just make my own observations about the overall ecosystem health that we're aiming to achieve, which does, I guess, consider the role, for example, that maintaining a healthy submerged plant environment on things such as stabilizing sediments. And so recognizing the whole story, I guess, is important, because by examining like the stream bank erosion effects, let's say at 2 meters versus 2.5, and I'll come back to that, there's also the other impacts on sediment processes that happen when we're actually destabilizing another part of the system that actually dampen sediment too, in a more natural process, in a sense. And so there's significant risks, in my view, from the not having a healthy plant community in terms of also the sediment aspect and other water quality features of the lagoon itself. And the frequency of opening is having an effect on that aspect of the sediment story. In terms of stream bank erosion, and noting that, again, this is not my field of expertise. I'm not a river geomorphologist at all, but I can talk about the frequency, I guess, of events specifically. I guess in a natural unmanaged environment versus what we are proposing in this consent. So if it was a natural unmanaged environment, water levels would certainly go above 2.5 meters, it's predicted by the Environment Southland hydrological modelling. And that would, I guess, go up some of the tributary creeks, as Richard Measures has identified in some of the work that he has submitted. So you'll get water pushing up the creek systems as it naturally goes higher. And water will naturally interact with the land. And it is a modified environment in a sense. So some of this land will be more, as I understand, potentially susceptible to erosion than it would be if it was a completely, native dominated creek system. And so with regards to, I guess, it's weighing up a sediment load under a larger area being inundated kind of question that you're asking, but a lower frequency of those things occurring versus a lower level, which is happening more frequently, but perhaps not as interacting much with the creeks. And unfortunately, I can't answer that, I guess, is where I'm going to land, because that is actually, I think, be, for your benefits, guessing too much right now. They may actually end up balancing out, potentially. The more extensive inundation, more sediment load versus more frequent, more often, there may end up in a moot point, potentially. But without having even a basic model in front of me to give you that conclusion, I feel like I'll be, I think, drawing too long above my expertise, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And it has been a concern that's been raised by several submitters, so something that we will need to take into consideration. And therefore, my other questions around that was about whether or not to have some type of monitoring control, so that's already been covered. So I'll just go back to the review process now, because I had just some additional questions on that. And I understand that you've caveated your advice, or said I can take my advice up to the point of giving the advice, and at that point it becomes an implementation decision. I'm still really quite unclear on like the so what, like you get all the information and what happens next, like how will the changes be implemented? And because I'm left with this level of uncertainty about well, what does it mean? It's quite challenging to understand the value of having the review process included in the consent. But noting that you can't, once you've given your advice, that's it. That's at the end of the process for you. I had 2 more questions based on your experience. And the first is it common for these types of large-scale long-term environmental consents for the consent holder to lead the review process? Have you seen this before, and is that common for the consent holder to do that?
To lead a review process.
Yes.
The one example I'll draw on is the wetland I referred to previously, Whanga Merino, where the consent holders there is also joint consent with the Department of Conservation and Fish and Game for this consent. And a review has been undertaken, I guess, there, and it was led by the consent holders. But in consultation with the regulatory authority, I guess, as we went through that process. So a fairly detailed technical review was undertaken on the effectiveness of the consent, and that was, it was led by the consent holders in that example.
Was it specified in the conditions that?
Oh, good point.
Occur?
That was a different one. That was an S127, I guess. Is that right? 127.
128 if
128, sorry.
Regulatory authority of doing it, but if you're amending the application, it's 127. But yeah, but it's not in the conditions. Well, it might be if it's a 128.
I think in that particular consent, it may be just a general review condition that may have been triggered, but wasn't necessarily had to be triggered. Type of example.
Could I just, Ms. Williams, do you know about the consent that Dr. Robertson's talking about?
I do, and I apologise actually, because I think I had said I would provide that to you. I do have and I can't now recall whether it was a section 127 or a section 128. I do have that review and the revised consent that was issued, and I can certainly forward that through.
Okay. If you've got, could you provide that with the case we referred to by 3 o'clock tomorrow? Excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Apologies, Commissioner Mackay. Carry on.
I only have one more question, and that's around how the information's been gathered and shared to date, and for a level of transparency. So if there's some type of consent holder internal review, then I just wanted to get an understanding, based on past practice that you've been involved in, what safeguards will be in place for some transparency to the other public and other stakeholders around the review process.
I mean, my role typically in these processes has been just the science input, firstly, I guess. So there's been the communication and sharing of information has been by others, I guess, in that the one we're just referring to for that WEAR consent review. And we were just responding to the directions, I guess, for the regulatory authority and doing as requested. And the information, I guess, that on behalf of the department, at least, who I work for, monitoring information is public information, in a sense. And so do our systems, can they always be better in terms of having public interfaces for very clear, where the data is held so anyone can access it? I think, and council's doing very, very good in this as well. Like, you can go online, you can get, you can see the results of the water level monitoring information. For example, there's other platforms like Awarua that has water quality information that's sometimes delayed, but I think sharing information, I believe, is critical. It happens at various levels in different projects I've been involved in. Sometimes we're good at getting information straight up online and available, and other times it takes us longer, which is not because we don't wish to do it. So yeah, I'm open to any suggestions, I guess, from yourselves as commissioners to make that efficient.
Okay, thank you. I only have one question, and it's taken you back to your evidence now, and at paragraph 69. And that's where you talked about the Manuka die-off. And I wanted to understand just this technical point just a little bit better, because we've had some concerns raised by submitters about the fringe wetlands, which you have addressed. But I wanted to understand, like, how do we distinguish, or how is it distinguished between the like beneficial natural shifts and then any harmful wetland change? And does the current monitoring program adequately respond to that?
What is proposed in the monitoring regime, as I understand, is I think a baseline assessment should be undertaken, because the previous survey is now sometime over 10 years old now. So I think I would recommend fairly soon a baseline assessment, and then it's recommended at 5-year intervals after that. One of the challenges with wetland plant communities is that they may take some time to, I guess, change to as conditions move. And so doing, for example, annual surveys where scientifically of interest to see about annual variation in some of these wetland plant communities, looking at the overall outcomes will be more possible from a longer period of time in terms of allowing plant establishment and so forth to settle out. So that's why that's proposed at a 5-year interval. I wouldn't want to delay it any more than 5 years. But there you'll be looking at I guess the difference between year 0 and year 5 and how things have changed. And then that would be part of the assessment in terms of the effectiveness of the opening regime on that set of values at that time.
That's really helpful to understand. So the annual monitoring will tell you some things, but it's actually at that 5-year overall assessment point that will tell you a whole heap more. So thank you, that was helpful.
Right, thank you, Commissioner Mackay. Dr. Robertson, have you completed all of your sections?
It was only just a couple of, literally just 2 more bullet points in front of me. Just about the conditions themselves, and just to reiterate that the conditions proposed by the applicant have been directly informed by the technical review of consent conditions and are appropriate to support the site's restoration. And I guess just to also reiterate, we're only promoting a closed system in a sense for this period of 2 years, up to this level of 2.5. If everything else is good, like we keeping an eye on the monthly water quality sampling, the algal dominance, the general measures of ecosystem health, as well as whether fish passage is required too. So there may be concerns, I guess, in community that we're forgetting those things, but that's not at all the recommendation from a technical perspective. It's to seek to restore the system if the conditions allow it. And that's the way, in my view, that the conditions are formulated, to have those specific processes in mind, given that we have the ongoing pressure in terms of nutrient inputs and other things, which are in a longer term, a different freshwater planning process. So otherwise, that is all I have to say, and thank you for listening to me.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've probably got some more questions for you. See Dr. Booth nodding there, so we'll let him go first.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, it's not too much in this, Dr. Robertson. One of the questions that we've canvassed with a number of experts, and we heard a little bit from submitters, is what is, with the term of the consent sword, what is a kind of endpoint, I call it, because we've heard the proposal and what you're seeking to achieve in restoring those natural processes. We've also heard a lot about what's happening in the catchment and the improvements that the landowners are all trying to achieve. And we've heard that, you know, from a number of the submitters that almost everyone in the catchment is doing something to improve the matters that are of concern for the lagoon. So I'm trying to understand, is there an aim, or is there a point where we get where that balance of improvements in the catchment have reduced the inputs such that the regime that you proposed might change or dial back to something that has occurred in the past? Do you have a vision of that in this?
My vision would be that there were conditions relating to water quality, like the triggers relating to water quality, we don't have to use them because the water quality of the system is as such that actually we're well away from those triggers being met and there's no concerns. But we are still applying the triggers for fish passage because we are still wanting to promote those values for kanakana, for lamprey, and for other things. And they'll be informed on biomonitoring as well. And there's a good harmony, in a sense, between the 2-year phase. We're achieving this 2-year phase for the plant growth and supporting the wetland, fringing wetland vegetation and bird communities and other things, and the fish. So in a sense, we are going to, we apply the water quality maximum trigger of 2.5 because it's supporting the plant growth adequately, and the abundance and reproduction of those plants is progressing well, and we don't have any concerns, and so we're just on a fairly steady cycle after that. That would be my vision, I guess, for that 15-year to 20-year period.
And the water quality you mentioned, where you see that being achieved through the improvements that are happening by the landowners in the catchment. One of the things we did here, which I thought was quite insightful, was that getting the balance of timing right, I guess, with this, between the ability for landowners to implement changes on their land, which is not an overnight thing, and we heard can take many years or a decade in some cases, with the desire to maintain and improve the lagoon. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, are we stepping too early into this regime of the opening that has been proposed, balanced against the ability for the landowners to be able to achieve what they can achieve on their land?
I don't think so. And I guess that's the exact reason why we have that water quality condition, is it's recognizing that we have this ongoing pressure and we need to respond to that. It would be nice not to have it, but I guess given the situation we're in, it's important to not lead to a situation where we've got permanent coastal lagoon and algal bloom, in a sense. So we're mindful of the current situation, and the current regime takes that into account. So I don't feel it's inappropriate, while recognizing the importance of moving forward as much as possible in the catchment.
Presumably that review could take that into account as well, because you'll have the water quality to be able to ascertain that. Thank you. That's actually quite helpful. And just understanding, I've got a question about the term of the consent, because a number of submitters have sort of seen this perhaps as a bit of an experiment, and perhaps 20 years is far too long to be undertaking the regime, and that a shorter period might be more appropriate. Do you have a view on that?
I'm comfortable with the term that is proposed, and it is stepping up through different scenarios as well. It's not going to the end cycle straight away. The monitoring regime is relatively extensive. I would suggest there'll be significant costs to the applicant for the monitoring regime. and we've talked about already, and you've mentioned this 5-year review, and I guess there may be further questions on that for others who are in the planning space. But with those different, with the monitoring proposed in place, the transitional regime, as well as the ability to review its effectiveness, I feel that's appropriate to not then go back fairly soon into another fairly prolonged consent process as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's probably me complete.
Commissioner Mackay, do you have any other questions?
Yep. Well, I too had a question about like why a 20-year term, but the way that I was kind of phrasing it, wanting to understand better, is how does this term relate to the ability to detect meaningful ecological trends? So is having the multiple monitoring cycle, was that one of the factors that led to the 20-year timeframe being applied for?
No, the 20-year timeframe is based, I guess, on from a science perspective, we feel with the monitoring in place that it's fairly expansive across the range of values and concerns we have around how the system will respond. And so we have fairly high frequency water quality monitoring, annual assessments of a range of things. So, and this can inform the applicants, on when to utilize the water quality or ecosystem health measures as necessary. And so it's really based, so it's not based on the monitoring that we need, that we require a 20-year period. We just feel there's enough both certainty in our advice, given there's always uncertainty, of course, from a science perspective, but also safeguards, I guess, that it can be responsive to the monitoring information as it comes through. Then it gives our advice is there's no concern that the applicants wish to seek a 20-year term based on those safeguards being in place.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And then I'd probably just, so I've absolutely explored the question. I'd probably ask a bit of a flip question, which is there any ecological management risk if the consent term was significantly shorter?
From a technical period, I think from a technical perspective, no. I mean, we are more, we kind of look at the system in an annual period anyway. Every opening event, we're curious to know how the Laguna is responding. And therefore, purely based on a technical perspective, the only issue is really cost, I think, of having to, go through other processes such as what we're doing right now and not being able to invest in the actual management of the lagoon and the information that is requested. And so we're not getting on with the management and restoration of New Zealand's environment. But from a technical perspective, the term, is informed annually to a certain degree. Like it's fairly high frequency information requirements, so it doesn't matter if it's shorter. But I wouldn't advise it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions, Dr. Robertson. So, given that your evidence was prepared before the decision of the applicant in terms of the rather than the location, the alternative location being anywhere along the bank, that's now being narrowed. Does that change any of your evidence at all?
No, I don't. It doesn't affect my evidence. And the other locations, alternative locations, which are proposed, known locally as Hanson's Bay, I think, and the Fence. They're both locations where the lagoon water body itself comes close to the gravel bar, because there are other areas where there's a bit of, I guess, other wetland type dominated by, not open water areas, but they're sort of indigenous wetland areas, which are much further away from the actual barrier. And those locations also have been used on 2 occasions, I think once each, not in the last few years. And so there is a history of those locations, but I have advised on the less information we have around some of the likely effects, I guess, of those locations. And just with the very long history of using Walker's Bay, we've got a good level of understanding across a range of experts about, what kind of happens to the lagoon at that location, which gives a surety, I guess, from ourselves to the applicants that it's a site with known, I guess, consequences in terms of how things respond. That's why it's suggested to have those as alternatives, subject to an assessment of some sort about potential effects relative to Walker's Bay.
Okay, thank you. Then, in terms of, we've asked you some questions about how the potential openings would be managed from a decision-making process for the scientific advisory group. Would you see you or anyone from that group having a role in the actual openings, the implementation of the openings themselves? And if yes, what would that be?
Not directly. We provided, I guess, what we have done in the past, and I would expect this to continue. For example, opening location, we'll be providing advice to the practitioners. So those who have got the skills to utilize the machinery needed and to undertake it effectively. You don't really want to get in their way on the day. It's important that they implement their task, but we will often make recommendations about, can you use this location if possible? Or we may be interested in some collection of other information, let's say, which is, incidental just to a general understanding of, maybe water quality dynamics, or to please take photos, those kind of things.
Right.
But there's no need for the science group to be involved in the opening itself, as I see it.
Okay, thank you. Turning to the conditions, have you had a chance to see any of the questions or that? Well, have you had a chance to review the conditions that were attached to Ms. Thorne's evidence, which is the proposed draft conditions, the 42A version with track changes that she was recommending? And I wondered whether some of the things that you consider in terms of monitoring, have they been included in that set of conditions?
There was also, I'm just looking at it in front of me, one of the, I think, further requests for information in June. I think it was an Appendix D, which had a draft monitoring plan. Now, one of my roles was to provide advice on that monitoring plan to the applicants. So I am aware of it, and I am comfortable with what is proposed in the Appendix D of the, the lawyers and planners might have the right reference, but it was provided in June, as I understand.
Yep. Okay. But we highlighted some issues in there about standards effectively being within some of the monitoring plans proposed, and that those matters would need to be in conditions rather than within the management plan, which should really just cover how you're going to do it. So no, that's fine. Okay. I don't have anything further. Commissioner Boothroyd, Commissioner Mackay, any last questions?
Not from me, thank you, Dr. Robertson.
I just have one final question. So at the hearing, I asked all of the submitters whether the applied for trigger levels were preferable to having no managed regime at all. And given that it's been asked of everyone, I thought it was appropriate to ask you. However, given you support the proposed levels, I thought perhaps the question for you would be, what would be the main ecological or management risks if there were no consent and no managed opening regime? So it lines in with your expert advice.
An unmanaged regime, yes, has significant risks to Waituna Lagoon. We have seen with water quality monitoring, for example, and the evidence of Mr. Rebel, that if the system is closed for a prolonged period of time, nitrogen, phosphorus levels can start to increase, but that can sometimes take a while to kick in as well. But I can foresee if there's, for example, the system had remained closed for a 5-year period or something along those, like much longer, double waters have occurred recently. The evidence suggests that the water quality decline would be a significant risk. And then that will actually affect all the other values as well, from a range of, whether it's depending on how bad it gets. So it'd be nice not to be in that situation where we have that level of inputs coming in, but it is just the situation that we're in. So, just an aside, many other lakes in New Zealand that aren't next to the coast don't have this opportunity. So it's, in a way, it's a blessing, but it's not. But the pressure really is on the farming community to deal with, you say, eutrophication of a closed freshwater system and somewhere else in the country. So we have ability here through managed opening to look after the ecosystem because of it happens to be next to the coast and there's an opportunity. But we have to do that really carefully and not open it so frequently that we affect all these other values at the same time. And so I guess that's the balance that we're trying to seek. But certainly an unmanaged regime I would not support at this stage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. Nothing further from me. That brings us pretty much to the close of today's session. The other items that we just need to make sure, I want to make sure that people are aware of, and that. So, Ms. Williams, you've got a couple of things to send in to us tomorrow. So the next formal part of the hearing process is the conferencing of the planners on conditions, and that I understand is going to occur on the 25th of this month, August, and then the joint witness statement from that is due on the 29th at the latest, and following that there's the opportunity for any of the parties, submitters in particular, to comment on anything that was brought up today, or as to the conditions and the risk assessment that's been provided, and just reminding everybody that we want any comments on those matters confined to that rather than going back over old ground, and that's due by 3 o'clock on Friday the 5th of September, and then all of that information will get sent all to the parties, and then the final step will be the applicant's right of reply, which is due 3 o'clock on Friday the 12th of September. So that's all for the moment. So we'll adjourn the hearing now at 12:18, and once we've got all of the right of reply, we'll then look to make sure we've got all the correct information that we need, and then we would, if we do, then we'll close the hearing by way of a minute and then proceed to deliberations and decision writing. So thanks everybody for today, and we've still got a bit of a process to go. Thank you very much.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.